Hey everyone, Laurie Spencer here. Welcome back to this History Book Club reading of The Kennedys After Camelot by New York Times bestselling author J. Randy Taraborelli. Please take a moment to like this video and share that playlist link, which is down in the comments section, with anyone that you think might enjoy this Kennedy family book club so that they can listen to every episode back to back. And if you'd like to support my efforts with a donation, check out my wish list at giftapp.com/reallaurie-spencer, where you can select a book that you'd like me to consider for a future book club reading. There are lots of great Kennedy family history books on my wish list for you to choose from. So today, in episode 3, we will explore the story of a man who some say was the best Kennedy, even though he wasn't a Kennedy. Today, we will learn about the incredible life of Sargent Shriver, husband of Eunice Kennedy Shriver. Sarge, as we called him, was the founder of the Peace Corps and the Special Olympics, leader of the war on poverty, including initiatives like Head Start, Vista, and Job Corps. He also served as the first director of the Office of Economic Opportunity and was U.S. Ambassador to France under President Lyndon Johnson. In many ways, it seemed that after the assassination of JFK and RFK, Sargent Shriver would be the next president to emerge from the Camelot era, perhaps in 1968 or 1972 or 76. But sadly for Sarge, it never happened. In this chapter, we'll find out why. If you're reading along in the hardcover edition of After Camelot, please do read along with me if you've got a copy. We're going to be starting today's reading on page 52, Part 3, Sarge. President Barack Obama perhaps said it best when, following Sargent Shriver's death in 2011, he referred to him as, quote, one of the brightest lights of the greatest generation. Many historians feel that Sargent should have, made a great president, that he would have made a significant impact on this country's landscape in the turbulent 1960s and 70s had he just had the opportunity to do so. Not only did he have the energy, the imagination, the magnetism and sense of purpose and duty, but he also possessed what seemed like an organic need to be of service. He cared about society, and he cared deeply. However, one significant stumbling block kept him from advancing his political career: the ambition of the Kennedy family. First, though, a little history about the man his friends and family simply called Sarge. Robert Sargent Shriver Jr. was born in Westminster, Maryland in 1915. His German forebears among the early settlers of Baltimore. The Shriver family is descended from David Shriver, who signed the Maryland Constitution and Bill of Rights at Maryland's Constitutional Convention of 1776. Sargent's father, Robert, was a banker who had married his second cousin, Hilda Shriver. The Shrivers were hardworking, though not affluent. Following admission on a full scholarship to Canterbury, a private school in New Milford, Connecticut, Sarge graduated in 1934 and spent the next 7 years at Yale, where he earned both his undergraduate degree in 1938 and his law degree in 1941. As a member of America First, an anti-war organization, Shriver opposed the country's entrance into World War II. But, as a patriotic American, he volunteered anyway, serving in the Navy for 5 years, rising through the ranks to lieutenant, and earning a number of commendations for valor. He later recanted his opposition to the war. Sargent Shriver's first encounter with the Kennedys came in 1946, when the family's patriarch, Joseph, recruited him to serve as director of Chicago's Merchandise Mart, a homes furnishings enterprise. A year earlier, Joe had bought the monolithic limestone and terracotta landmark in Chicago for $13 million, which at half of what it cost to build was a very good investment. Quote, people often ask where the Kennedys' greatest source of income comes from, Sargent Shriver once said while taking a journalist on a tour of the property. Well, here it is. Though it was an off-the-record remark, it was published just the same. Sargent Shriver would never make such a statement on the record. In fact, over the years, it would be the income generated by the rental of office and exhibit space in the merchandise mart that financed the public and private lives of all the Kennedys, from Joe and Rose down to the second generation and the third, and today, even the fourth and the fifth. At the time Joe Kennedy hired him, Sargent had been working as a journalist, first at Time magazine and then Newsweek. He became an official part of the Kennedy family in 1954 when he married Eunice at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York. Many people today believe that Sargent Shriver started the Peace Corps. That's not exactly true. It had actually been President John F. Kennedy's idea, but Sarge implemented it. In JFK's first public utterance following his oath of office on becoming president, his inaugural speech in January 1961, he threw down the gauntlet to the American people, imploring them, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." This call to service did not fall trippingly off his tongue. It came together following his anguish over the exact wording of how to elicit the most profound response. President Kennedy later pointed out that the Soviet Union had, quote, hundreds of men and women, scientists, physicists, teachers, engineers, doctors, and nurses prepared to spend their lives abroad in the service of world communism. The United States had no such program, and Kennedy wanted to involve Americans more actively in the cause of global democracy, peace, development, and freedom. He turned to Sargent Shriver, asking him to organize a Peace Corps task force. An executive order dated March 1st, 1961, less than 2 months after Kennedy's inauguration, established the Peace Corps, with Sargent Shriver as its first director. After half a century of service, the Peace Corps continues to be vital and to grow. Inspired by JFK's vision, it has become an agency devoted to world peace, with volunteers helping individuals to build better lives for themselves, their family, their community, and their country. After Sargent Shriver distinguished himself in the administration of JFK, he continued to serve President Lyndon Johnson after Kennedy's assassination, creating for LBJ the Office of Economic Opportunity, which was later called the War on Poverty and eventually the Shriver Center, and serving as its first director. It was through the OEO that Shriver created Head Start, a program of the United States Department of Health and Human Services, brilliantly conceived as an early intervention program to provide education and nutrition for low-income children and their families. Of course, I will pause here to point out that our current Secretary of Health and Human Services is Robert F. Kennedy, Jr., and under those Doge cuts and the trimming of the fat, if you will, in the Republican budget bill, Head Start and Job Corps and several of these programs that Sargent Shriver actually founded are now under threat of losing their funding or closing their doors forever. Back to the book. Sarge always seemed to recognize that there was more to life than politics, maybe unusual in a family like the Kennedys, where, at least for the men, politics often seemed to matter more than anything. To Sarge, his family was paramount. He had a strong moral code and passed it on to his children. Quote, "He's the one who taught me it's never worth stabbing someone in the back to get ahead," his daughter, Maria Shriver, would recall. Quote, "He said that talent and smarts always wins out, that if you're good, you'll get that great job. He said, never let a puffed up ego make decisions for you." Another priority for Shriver was his faith. Wherever he traveled to, the first question off his lips would be, "Where's the nearest Catholic church?" his son, Mark Shriver, observed. Daddy was joyful until the day he died, and I think that joy was deeply rooted in his love affair with God. Daddy loved God, and God loved him right back. Daddy let go. God was in control, and oh, what a relationship they had. Repeatedly over the years, the needs and desires of various Kennedy family members and their advisors would take precedence over what would have been in Sargent Shriver's own best interest. Because he was unfailingly loyal to his wife's family, there was always a sort of glass ceiling as to how much Sarge would be able to achieve as a public servant. Not that his accomplishments weren't many and weren't historical in their own right, because they were. However, one has to wonder how much more he might have accomplished if not for the fact that one Kennedy or another was always standing in his way, first in 1959, then in 1964, 1968, 1972, and finally in 1976. It started in the spring of 1959 when there was scuttlebutt that Shriver might run for governor of Illinois. Because he had strong connections in that state and a solid groundswell of support, he toyed with the idea. He hadn't even made a decision, one way or the other, about it, though, when Joe Kennedy heard these rumblings. "What's this I hear about you maybe running for governor?" Joseph asked his son-in-law one afternoon at LaGuardia, the Palm Beach estate. Sargent said he hadn't made up his mind yet, but that, yes, he had been approached, and there seemed to be significant interest. "Well, let me help make up your mind," Joe said. "It can't happen. The whole family is behind Jack for president right now, so forget it. Jack needs your help with his campaign." And that was the end of that, at least for the time being. Not only did Joseph ask for Sargent's assistance, Jack also had asked for his help, as did his wife, Eunice. That's what Hugh Sidey recalled, Time magazine journalist. That was a lot of pressure. There wasn't much Sargent could do but sublimate his own desires for that of the family's, which would, as it would turn out, become a recurring way of life for him. In temperament and personality, Sarge wasn't as shrewd as JFK or as cunning as Bobby, and everyone knew it. Sarge was thought of not only by some of the Kennedys, but also by many of their counselors, men who wielded great influence over members of the family, such as speechwriter Ted Sorensen and Kennedy aide Kenny O'Donnell, as a lightweight, a pretender to the throne. They looked at Sarge as naive, a romanticist who believed too much in the good of people, rarely recognizing man's duplicitous nature. That was certainly an ironic view of him, especially when one considers that President Kennedy's new frontier would be built on a platform of idealism. They believed Shriver had good ideas and was obviously able to make them work in government, but because he wasn't a real Kennedy, he'd never have the same drive, ambition, and smarts as a real Kennedy. That's how veteran White House reporter Helen Thomas put it. Maybe Bobby said it best when once asked what he thought about Sargent Shriver. "He's a very good Shriver," was his response. Teddy also felt that way. Surprisingly, so did Stephen Smith, Jean Kennedy's husband, who was also not a real Kennedy, but in his view, at least never tried to act like one. The next time Sargent Shriver's ambition was thwarted was in 1964. At the time, President Lyndon Johnson had been considering possible running mates for the presidential election, and Sargent weighed heavily on his mind. Johnson respected Shriver so much that on the day JFK was shot, he promised him that if he could, he would one day show just how much he appreciated him. By 1964, with 3 years of success with the Peace Corps under his belt, Time magazine famously had reported, "The Peace Corps has captured the public's imagination as has no other single act of the Kennedy administration." Shriver continued to demonstrate the leadership qualities he'd shown as an important member of the Johnson cabinet as a special assistant to the president. However, Shriver's role within the Johnson administration always put him in a difficult position, stuck in the middle between LBJ and Bobby Kennedy, who hated each other, and the Kennedy family. LBJ wasn't in office very long before Bobby Kennedy made it clear that he might be interested in running against him in the 1968 election. For that reason, RFK never felt comfortable that Sargent Shriver was still a part of LBJ's administration. For his part, Bobby had lasted as Attorney General under LBJ for only 10 months after his brother's death, before departing to run for and win his seat in the Senate representing the state of New York. But Shriver was still working for LBJ. The fact that LBJ had such a direct pipeline to the Kennedys through one of their own, namely Sargent Shriver, troubled a lot of the family members, said Jack Valenti, who handled press relations for Lyndon Johnson, and of course who later went on to become the longtime president of the Motion Picture Association of America. Some even thought that Shriver's being a pipeline to the Kennedys was precisely why LBJ had brought him into his administration in the first place. Others would find this a simplification of LBJ's thinking, though it's difficult to believe that it hadn't at least crossed his mind. In fact, President Johnson had other reasons for wanting Sargent Shriver around. Of all the Kennedys, LBJ loathed Bobby Kennedy with a burning, searing passion. Everybody knew it, and everyone also knew that Bobby felt the same way about Johnson. Still, because of the memory of JFK, President Johnson suspected he would have a clear advantage at the polls if he could at least try to stomach Bobby on the ticket with him. But that was asking a lot, more than LBJ could conceive of, in fact. One way for him to avoid the problem of aligning himself with a running mate he detested was to associate himself with the next best thing in the campaign, a Kennedy brother-in-law, and it could be argued the best of the bunch, Sargent Shriver. To LBJ, this seemed like a very good strategy. Quote, most people liked and respected Sargent, and LBJ could put up with him a lot easier than he could any other Kennedy family member, with the possible exception of Jackie, said Jack Valenti. Because it became such a serious consideration for him, word of a possible LBJ Shriver ticket soon leaked out to the press. Scott Stossel has a very telling story in his excellent book, Sarge, The Life and Times of Sargent Shriver. One day in the spring of 1964, Sargent Shriver was at the Kennedy compound relaxing when Bobby Kennedy happened by. Shriver and Kennedy had always had a difficult, though usually respectful, relationship. Though they tolerated each other because of Eunice, the two were like oil and water. Whereas Shriver was amiable and good-natured and diplomatic, Bobby was moody, explosive, and dogmatic. "What's this I hear about you being on the Johnson ticket as vice president?" Bobby asked his brother-in-law, according to Sargent's later memory of the event. The two men faced each other, standing just inches apart. Bobby tended to invade another's personal space when he was being confrontational. Shriver would recall feeling immediately uncomfortable. "Well, nothing's been decided," Shriver said cautiously, "so I'm not sure what will happen." Suddenly, in one swift and threatening moment, Bobby Kennedy reached out and pulled Sargent in by his collar. "Let me make something clear," he said, in a tone that could only be described as menacing. "There's not going to be a Kennedy on this ticket," he said, "and if there were, it would be me." Shriver didn't know how to respond to that. "Well, like I said," he told Bobby, backing away from him but still standing his ground, "nothing's been decided." Bobby sized him up for a moment and then turned and walked away without comment. And I'm going to skip forward a few pages here because it's just a brief biographical sketch of Bobby Kennedy, who he was, and I think most of you already know who Bobby Kennedy was, or you can consult Google to find out more about Senator Robert F. Kennedy. And I'm going to skip forward to page 60 and dive back in where we left off there in 1964. After Jack's death, Bobby was a changed man, recalled his former press secretary, Frank Mankiewicz. Though he tried to encourage everyone to go on with their lives and offered his support to family members in innumerable ways, he fell into a deep and awful depression. "I was shocked by his appearance," recalled author William Manchester, who was at the time in talks with Jackie Kennedy to write a book about Jack's assassination. Of course, that's death of a president. He had met privately with Bobby in that capacity. He said, quote, "I have never seen a man with less resilience. Much of the time he seemed to be in a trance, staring off into space, his face a study in grief." No one could really help Bobby, not even his wife, Ethel, whereas it would have seemed that Ethel would be the one who could have reached him. This was not the case. He could have long conversations about his brother with his sister-in-law, Jackie, but not with Ethel. She was closed off from the pain of losing Jack and simply couldn't or wouldn't discuss it. Her coping mechanism was to avoid sadness because she feared that if she gave into it, she would fall into a depression so deep that she might never emerge. She had long ago learned to live her life as dispassionately as possible when it came to dealing with the deaths of loved ones. Therefore, when she did talk about Jack, it was always in empty platitudes. For instance, one night, according to the family history, Bobby was particularly sad at the dinner table. "There will never be anyone like Jack again," he said. Ethel looked over at him and said, "Well, don't worry, Bobby, because Jack is in heaven, looking after all of us, and everything will be okay." It wasn't what he needed to hear at that moment. He shook his head in dismay. "And those were the words spoken by the wife of the Attorney General of the United States," he said, his tone one of disdain. Bobby tried to go on, and of course he would go on, but it was different for him after November 1963. With Lyndon Johnson as president, Bobby's role in the government was greatly diminished. He served in LBJ's cabinet for less than a year before resigning over Johnson's escalation of the Vietnam War. He viewed the war as divisive and unwinnable and felt he could best oppose it by becoming a senator from New York in 1964, replacing Senator Kenneth Keating, who was retiring. He also felt that with 500,000 troops now overseas, there was little hope that the escalation of the war would end anytime soon. Therefore, he began speaking out against it, and with each speech he felt a bigger groundswell of public support. By 1967, it had become clearer than ever that Bobby Kennedy intended to run against LBJ for the presidency in 1968. The possibility that Robert F. Kennedy might enter the presidential race was of great concern to President Lyndon Johnson. Almost as bad for Johnson was the very real possibility that Sargent Shriver might somehow end up a part of the RFK team. After all, at this time, the beginning of 1968, Sarge was still director of the Peace Corps under Johnson and also special assistant to the president. Though Bobby had made it clear that he considered Sarge a threat, Sarge was still his brother-in-law. Therefore, Bobby would likely find a place for him on his campaign, and it was thought that Sargent would probably accept such an appointment. Thus, it had become a very real possibility that an important and well-respected person in LBJ's cabinet, Sarge, could end up aligned with one of the president's sworn enemies, Bobby. LBJ wasn't happy about any of it and felt that he needed to take some kind of decisive action. The next thing everyone knew, he came up with the novel idea of packing Sargent Shriver up and sending him off to Europe as ambassador to France. Obviously, the president wanted Shriver out of the country and as far away from the Kennedys as possible, thus the offer. It wasn't as if there were many in his administration or in the Kennedy family who didn't realize his true motivations. The question was whether or not Sarge and Eunice would go for it. It wasn't the worst idea in the world for Sargent, recalled Senator George Smathers, in that it would get him out of a bad situation. He was either going to have to remain loyal to LBJ, as was his duty, or remain loyal to the Kennedys. The problem was thought to be Eunice. If Bobby was going to run for president, no way was she not going to be in the States to help with the campaign. It seemed pretty black and white that Eunice would never go. Torn loyalties. Over the years, it has repeatedly been theorized that Eunice Kennedy Shriver would unequivocally support her family's interests over her husband's. She was a Kennedy, it has been explained, and as a Kennedy, she would naturally place more importance on what her family wanted than on what Sargent wanted. But this was simply not the case. In fact, the opposite was usually true. Eunice almost always supported her husband's interest before her family's, and it was well known in the family that this would be her position. She believed Sargent was a great man and always maintained that it did not diminish her brothers or anyone else in the family to recognize Sarge's immense contribution to society and his own political goals and ambitions. Yes, of course, she wanted the best for her Kennedy family, but she was also a very independent woman. She didn't just go along with the family's aspirations. She was a Shriver as well as a Kennedy, and she wanted what was best for her husband. Anyone who thought otherwise just didn't know Eunice Kennedy Shriver. This loyalty pull would always be an issue for her, though, sometimes causing her great pain. She simply couldn't understand why her family was so ambivalent about Sarge. Considering all of the good Sargent had done for America, Eunice just couldn't fathom how anyone could be so dismissive of him. Her father, Joe Kennedy, certainly didn't feel that way. He'd made it clear many times that he was a big supporter of Sarge's. Were Bobby and Teddy just jealous? The more she thought about it, the more Eunice was able to trace the family's ambivalence about Sargent back to his decision to stay on with LBJ after JFK was killed. They were upset about anybody working for President Johnson, Eunice would admit many years later. But Sarge felt a real loyalty to the programs, she said. I agreed with him. What was the alternative? Sarge has terrific talent and great concern for people who are underdogs. That's not something he came upon when he married me or when he went to work for the Johnson administration. It was part of the very core of his being. If you take that out of somebody's life because you think he's being disloyal to a man who is dead, well, I just didn't think it made any sense. Eunice thought she at least had her mother Rose's support when it came to Sargent, but then in March 1968, something happened that made her question even that. During a visit to Timberlawn, Rose Kennedy had asked Sarge to take a walk with her after lunch. She told him that she understood that LBJ had offered him the ambassadorship to France, and she wondered if he was going to accept the position. He said, according to his later memory of the conversation, that he hadn't made up his mind. She wanted to know why. He was still considering possibly running for office in Illinois, he told her, and also he wanted to make sure he wasn't needed in Washington. Perhaps he was alluding to a position on Bobby's team if Bobby decided to run for president. Rose Kennedy said, quote, I want to tell you something, Sarge. Getting offered the opportunity to be ambassador is the best thing that could happen to you and your family. When Joe became ambassador to Great Britain, it was marvelous for our children. You've got an opportunity here to do for your family what Joe was able to do for ours. As they walked along one of the manicured pathways of Timberlawn, Rose continued, saying, You know, it's quite a compliment the president's paying you by asking you to be ambassador to France. Sargent agreed. Then why haven't you accepted? She pressed him. Why haven't you told him you're ready to go? When Sargent reported back to Eunice the conversation he'd had with her mother, Eunice wasn't sure what to think. It was obvious to her, as it was to just about everyone else for that matter, that LBJ just wanted Shriver out of the country to clear out another Kennedy acolyte. LBJ's wishes aside, if Bobby was to run for president, shouldn't Sargent be in America to help with the campaign? He had been invaluable to JFK's campaign, after all. It was as if Rose Kennedy was now another family member who didn't recognize Sargent's true value. Perhaps the Kennedy matriarch wasn't looking at it quite that way and really was just trying to be supportive, but it felt to Eunice that she had aligned herself with Bobby and Ted in their view of Sargent. If that's how Mother feels and that's how Bobby feels, then fine. I say we go, Eunice decided. Of course, there were other reasons to go as well, as Eunice well knew. She might have been a little annoyed at the time, but she was also eager for new opportunities abroad and realized her husband would excel at his ambassadorship, observed Jack Valenti. It was an important job, and certainly peace could not occur in Vietnam without France's involvement. Sargent Shriver was more than qualified. He had the diplomatic skills necessary for the job and could doubtless act as a valuable conduit between French President Charles de Gaulle and the American President Lyndon Johnson, or whomever would be his successor. Therefore, in the second week of March 1968, Sargent Shriver accepted President Johnson's offer to be ambassador to France. Just a couple of days after Sargent Shriver told the president that he would accept the assignment to France, Robert Kennedy announced that he was running for president of the United States. Most people in the Kennedy camp were very enthusiastic about Bobby's plans, but surprisingly, Teddy was not. Ted's position was that it was the wrong time for Bobby to emerge as a presidential candidate, recalled his longtime friend and legislative aide, David Burke. His concern was that, in the end, the election would not be about Vietnam. It would be about the Kennedys and whether or not the family was hungry for power. He was afraid that Bobby's running would be negatively perceived by many Americans and that if he lost the election, it would contaminate the terrain for 1972. He was worried about the Democratic Party. Ted was very shrewd about politics, in some ways more shrewd than Bobby, and that was saying a lot. He was afraid the party would end up splintered, and as a result, someone like Richard Nixon could end up president. He turned out to be very prescient. Then, of course, there was that personal issue. He would never say it, but he was afraid of losing Bobby the way he had lost Jack. He would say things like, quote, "We're not that far from 1963, which would hint at his true feelings. There was a lot of fear there, which was understandable. Still, the announcement was made on March 16, 1968, at the caucus room of the old Senate office building, the same room where his brother had declared his own candidacy 8 years earlier. RFK said, quote, "I do not run for the presidency merely to oppose any man, but to propose new policies. I run because I am convinced that this country is on a perilous course, and because I have such strong feelings about what must be done, and I feel that I'm obliged to do all that I can." That same week, Sargent and Eunice Shriver hosted Joan Braden and Jackie Kennedy for dinner at Timberlawn. Over the meal, Jackie brought up Sargent's possible appointment as ambassador. According to what Joan Braden later recalled, Jackie said she thought it was an interesting idea, but she was suspicious of LBJ's motives. "After all," she said, "did you know that he once wanted to name me ambassador to Mexico?" Everyone was more than a little surprised by that revelation. Even Sarge didn't know about it. In fact, back in November of 1963, right after JFK's death, LBJ came up with the unusual idea of naming Jackie ambassador to Mexico, replacing the then present ambassador Thomas C. Mann, who had been appointed to that position by JFK and was set to retire in December. LBJ discussed the matter with an aide in a taped telephone conversation. "This is screwy," he said, "but can you hold on to your chair?" LBJ asked his aide. "Would it be just terrible to ask Mrs. Kennedy to be ambassador to Mexico?" LBJ laughed nervously when the aide seemed taken aback by the idea. When the aide said he needed to sleep on the idea, LBJ continued to push it. Finally, the aide said he was concerned about how Jackie and the public might perceive the offer. What would be the effect of that? "There wouldn't be any effect if nobody knew about it but just the two of us," LBJ argued, "and I wouldn't mention it to anybody but you. And if she didn't want to accept, nobody would ever know it but you. And if she did want to, God, it would electrify the Western Hemisphere," Johnson continued. It'd be more than any alliance for progress, and she could go on and do as she damn well pleased. She'd just walk out on that balcony and look down at them, and they'd all just pee all over themselves every day. When the aide still seemed hesitant, LBJ asked, "She wouldn't be mad at the offer, would she?" The aide answered, "Oh, God, no." Then after an awkward beat, "God, no." And another beat, "God, no." LBJ continued, "You think they, presumably the public, would think we're trying to use her or something?" "I'd really like to think about it," answered the aide. LBJ then said he had recently talked to Jackie, and she just oohed and awed over the phone, and she's just the sweetest thing, and she was always nicer to me than anybody in the Kennedy family, which is true, by the way. She just always made me feel like a human being, LBJ said. And that's the biggest thing I got to offer, and I think it would just revolutionize Latin America. Jackie could live in Mexico for 3 weeks, LBJ said, and come back to the States for a week if she wanted to, because I don't give a damn what she does, he said. But I think she and Tom Mann together would sew up this hemisphere, and I believe that's what she'd want to do. And I think her husband up in heaven would look down and say, by God, he, LBJ, saw that she had it, just like I did. In the end, LBJ decided not to present his offer to Jackie. The offer instead went to career officer Fulton Freeman. However, Jackie found out about it anyway from Ethel, who heard about it from Bobby. Jackie respected Thomas Mann. She had met him when she and Jack visited Mexico. "Looks like he just wanted to use you, Jackie," Sargent opined. "What do you know about Mexican affairs?" he added with a gentle smile. "That's exactly my point," Jackie exclaimed. "And now I think he's using you, Sarge." Sargent didn't comment on Jackie's theory. Neither did Eunice. That Bobby Kennedy had officially announced his intention to run against him was not good news for President Johnson. But at least he had gotten Sargent Shriver out of the picture. LBJ was tickled that he could hold a Kennedy brother-in-law out of the race, said his aide, Joseph Califano. To him, the appointment of Shriver as ambassador to France was made in political heaven. But then, at the end of March, in what was nothing if not a fast-moving story, a plot twist occurred that few saw coming. Lyndon Johnson decided that he would not accept the Democratic nomination for president in the 1968 campaign. In the end, there were many reasons for LBJ's surprising decision, but the unpopularity of the Vietnam War most certainly topped that list. Throughout his presidency, Johnson had been adamant that America could not lose the war, for if it did, the country would appear weak to the world, and he feared risk making its global interests more vulnerable to attack. At the time, it was said that JFK had intended to cut back the number of troops in Vietnam, and of course that theory is up for debate now, with some historians considering it revisionist history. But it became LBJ's mandate to increase those numbers, and as he did, the casualties mounted as well. By 1968, it was a very unpopular war, and most Americans linked it and the deaths of so many servicemen to their president. All of his other achievements, his successful push towards civil rights, for instance, and his and Sargent Shriver's war on poverty, didn't much matter when contrasted against the Vietnam War, at least in the popularity polls of the time, noted Jack Valenti. In fact, Johnson realized that there was practically no way he would be reelected and decided to bow out, stunning the entire country with his now famous words, "I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president." In short order, Vice President Hubert Humphrey announced his own candidacy for president. Now that LBJ was officially out of the race, was it really necessary for Sargent Shriver to accept that post he'd been offered as ambassador to France? Perhaps not. Certainly, if Bobby had simply appealed to Sargent and told him that he was needed on the campaign, it seemed unlikely that Shriver would have gone to Paris. But I don't think he ever felt, quite honestly, that it really made a difference to Bobby, Eunice would say in an interview in 1972. In those 3 or 4 months that led up to the decision for Bobby to run, Sarge was never consulted. He knew Bobby could get along very well without him. When Sarge is told he could make a difference, he doesn't hesitate 20 seconds, Eunice said. In fact, Bobby asked Eunice to intervene and talk to Sargent about possibly becoming involved in the campaign. However, Eunice felt strongly that if her brother needed Sargent's help, he should be the one to ask for it, again demonstrating her genuine loyalty to Sarge. That Bobby asked her for help and she refused him said a lot. "Bobby, why don't you talk to him?" she pressed him, according to her memory. "He'll do anything you want him to do." However, Bobby was nothing if not stubborn, and he still resisted personally calling Sargent. His reluctance just made no sense to Eunice. Certainly, if Sargent needed Bobby's assistance, she reasoned, he would have just shown him the respect of picking up the telephone and calling him personally. Now, Eunice was starting to get angry. Finally, in early April, Bobby Kennedy did make an overture to Sargent Shriver. He dispatched an attorney named Donald Dell to meet with him. Until very recently, Donald Dell had been a special assistant to Shriver in the Office of Economic Opportunity. A former professional tennis player and 3-time All-American, Dell had been a member of the U.S. Davis Cup team and would go on to become one of the nation's first professional sports agents. In 2009, he was later inducted into the International Tennis Hall of Fame. In 1968, he had just begun working for the RFK campaign. Bobby had been a close friend and frequent tennis partner. According to what Dell recalled many years later, quote, "Bobby obviously knew of my history and my close friendship with Sarge, which is why he sent me to meet with him. We sat down in one of the parlors of Timberlawn's main house and talked about Bobby's candidacy. You could really talk to Sarge. Anyone could, really. He was very approachable." Donald began, "So, Sarge, we were thinking, what are the chances of you not going to Paris and staying here to work for Bobby?" Shriver seemed to mull it over for a second. Though he didn't say as much, he was perhaps still wondering why Bobby hadn't called him personally. "It does sound interesting," he said, "but I'm not really sure that I'm needed." "Why, of course you're needed, Sarge," Donald responded, according to his memory of the conversation. "How could you think otherwise? Bobby has the greatest respect for you." Sarge didn't respond. At just that moment, Eunice walked into the room with her usual briskness. After carefully studying the two for a moment, she said, "And what's going on here?" The two men just looked at her. "Well, I think we should leave for dinner now, Sarge," she said, eyeing them with more than a little suspicion. "I have reservations at 8, you know." She and her husband then shared a secret look. "So what are you two talking about anyway?" she asked. "Well, Donald here has an interesting proposition," Sarge answered. "Oh, really?" Eunice asked as she stood before her husband and the visitor. Since the two men were still seated on cushioned chairs, Eunice towered over them in a way that was perhaps a tad intimidating. "Bobby sent me to talk to Sarge about possibly joining the campaign," Donald said. "We all know Sarge would be invaluable to—" And Eunice cuts him off. "Well, that can't happen," she said, her face darkening. "It's not possible now." "Why is that?" Donald asked. Looking down at Sargent, Eunice asked in a commanding tone, "Well, you told the president we were going to France, didn't you? Isn't that what you said?" "Yes, I did say that," Sarge answered. "But you know, I thought that perhaps we could—" "Well, then that's that," Eunice said, interrupting her husband. "We're going to France to be ambassadors there, just as we promised President Johnson. So it's done. The decision is made," she concluded. "Now, let's go to dinner." Ted Kennedy had an ominous feeling about his brother's decision to run for president. He wasn't the kind of man to verbalize his fears to many people, but it had been clear from the beginning that he was afraid for Bobby's life. He decided to abandon his concerns and do what Kennedys always did at important junctures in their family history, pull together for the greater good. I know that he had a difficult time overcoming his fear, said David Burke, Ted's close friend. But at the time, what could he do? He couldn't just sit around in fear. He couldn't allow himself to be immobilized in that way. To the extent that Bobby believed with all his heart he could be of service, that the party needed him, indeed the country needed him, Ted had no choice but to be completely supportive. I have to also say, though, that Ted wasn't alone in his concerns. The rest of the family was quite fearful, but took on the same action as Ted, which was to swallow their fears and hope and pray for the best. Bobby Kennedy's 1968 campaign for his party's nomination was in high gear almost from the start, as he racked up delegates everywhere, attracted as they were by his youthful energy, his pit bull style, and his liberal agenda. But then, of course, everything changed one awful June night in 1968 when he was gunned down in Los Angeles. It seemed impossible, yet it was true. Another brother gone. It was as if everyone had to then reset and try to figure out how to proceed with all of the rules once again changed, just as they had been when Jack was killed, recalled David Burke. You had a sense that the world had gone mad, that nothing made any sense. It was as dark a time as I can remember, a period in our country's history we still have not been able to reconcile. Those of us who were personally involved were, of course, devastated beyond words. And I'm going to pause here and put in a shameless plug for my own podcast series. Some of you might have already watched it. I did, and am still doing, an investigative true crime series called Who Killed Bobby Kennedy, about the assassination of Senator Robert Kennedy in June of 1968. It's a 14-part series so far, and the latest episode, of course, takes you through these newly released RFK files that the Trump administration has finally made public after almost 60 years. It's fascinating stuff. If you're interested to learn more about the assassination of Robert Kennedy, why it happened, who actually did it, we investigate all of that in my series, Who Killed Bobby Kennedy, and I will put a link down in the comments section if you'd like to check it out. Back to the book. Of course, Bobby's senseless and tragic death would impact everyone in the Kennedy family in a deep and very personal way. His mother, Rose, would be left wondering how God could take her boys in such a cruel way. And her daughters, Bobby's sisters, would never be able to get over the loss. His devastated wife, Ethel, would be left with 11 children, her cross to bear made even heavier by the troubles her oldest sons would bring her in life. Her sister-in-law, Jackie, would take an unlikely husband, in great part due to her fear that her 2 children were now in danger. For their parts, Sarge and Eunice would leave for Paris, as they had agreed to do, but now with great sadness and regret. Meanwhile, the last surviving brother, Ted, would spend years trying to decide if he was up to the task of accepting his lot in life as the next Kennedy in line for the presidency. Without Bobby, life would go on for all of the Kennedys just as it had without Jack, but it would never be the same. I know there were feelings that we should not have gone, Eunice Kennedy said in 1972, referring to her husband Sargent Shriver's accepting the appointment as French ambassador by President Johnson, rather than staying in America and campaigning for her brother Bobby. But Sarge, she said, was not what you'd call an inner man on Bobby's campaign. He was never a close friend of Bobby's, she said. Certainly there were people in the Kennedy family who seemed to never have gotten over the Shrivers' decision, not understanding that it sprang, in part, from the feeling that Bobby hadn't had enough respect for Sarge to just call him and personally ask for his assistance. Your daddy didn't come back from France to campaign for our daddy, some of Ethel's children used to chide the Shriver children. Indeed, the sense that Sargent had somehow been disloyal was even passed on to the next generation of Kennedys, none of whom could have been expected to understand the subtle nuances of emotions that had figured into the Shriver's decision. The ill will against Sargent Shriver had been pretty subtle up until Bobby's death, but afterward it bubbled over in a very hurtful way. Sargent and Eunice had been in Paris on that terrible June day in 1968 when Bobby was killed. It just so happened that Teddy's wife, Joan, was there as well, visiting them. They returned immediately upon hearing the news, flying into LaGuardia Airport to rendezvous with family members and aides there. As some of these family members and Kennedy advisors loaded Bobby's casket onto the plane, Sarge tried to help. However, they angrily pushed him aside, acting as if he was a traitor. I think maybe nothing hurt him and Eunice more than that, Pierre Salinger later recalled. That was an awful way to treat Sarge. I don't think he ever got over it. And I'm just going to pause here to say that perhaps it's just my own personal theory, sort of being a longtime Kennedy historian and looking at this family dynamic between the Kennedys, especially the Ethel RFK side, and the Shriver family. I kind of wonder if that old wound plays any role in HHS Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s decisions to cut or get rid of so many of these great programs that were founded by Sargent Shriver and Eunice. It seemed to many that Ethel Kennedy was one of those who had held a grudge against Sargent for his decision. Ethel's feelings about the matter were very complex, though. When just weeks after Bobby's death in 1968, Hubert Humphrey began floating the idea of asking Sargent to be on his ticket as his Democratic running mate, Ethel was not comfortable with that idea at all. It was too soon, she felt, for anyone in the family to try to continue where Bobby had left off. Plus, there was a rule of succession in place, and she wanted the family to stick to it. It wasn't official, but it could not have been more clear. First Jack, then Bobby, then Ted, then maybe Sarge. Also, Ethel couldn't help but still question Sarge's loyalty to Bobby when she factored in his decision to go to France. Finally, and this was perhaps the biggest issue for her in her consideration of all this, she was loyal to Teddy at all costs. What he wanted, she wanted, and that was the end of it for her. He was always there for her as Bobby's stand-in, and she would be there for him, too, always. However, she was still deeply grieving Bobby's death and wasn't up to debating family politics, so she just let it be known that she wasn't supportive of the idea of Sarge taking part in the Humphrey campaign, and then let it sit. Maybe Eunice Kennedy Shriver didn't catch on to Ethel's signals because she told Life magazine in 1972, quote, "I consider Ethel my greatest friend. I've never had any feeling ever from her about disloyalty. And if she didn't want Sarge to do something, I have full 100% confidence that she would call me and say, 'For God's sake, will you say this or say that to Sargent?' Be that as it may, the clear word back to Hubert Humphrey was that the Kennedy family would not be pleased with the idea of Sargent Shriver as vice president. In fact, Kennedy aide Kenny O'Donnell, who often derisively referred to Shriver as half a Kennedy, went so far as to pass a message on to Humphrey that the family would consider adding Shriver to the ticket an unfriendly act. A big reason to bring Sargent Shriver onto the ticket, at least as Hubert Humphrey saw it, was to garner the Kennedys' blessing. What the Kennedys said and how they felt mattered a great deal to Democrats, and having them support the ticket might go a long way towards ensuring its victory at the polls, explained Time magazine's Hugh Sidey. However, if the Kennedys were going to just disavow Sargent Shriver, either by leaking negative stories to the press about him or even by just not saying anything at all about him, then what was the point of putting him on the ticket? Of course, such reasoning totally overlooked Sargent Shriver's years of stellar achievement and his obvious qualifications for the job. But, as Joseph Kennedy once put it, politics presents itself as a nasty bit of business, doesn't it? Besides Ethel, there were others in the Kennedy family and connected to it who were not exactly supportive of a Humphrey Shriver ticket. The family resents it, Stephen Smith told a Politico, off the record, at the time. It was clear that Stephen Smith resented it anyway, and Smith's feelings could not be overlooked. He was the family's financial analyst and political strategist. Not only was he responsible for much of the money that came in and went out of the Kennedy organization, but his duties also included raising money for all of the campaigns, namely Jack's, Bobby's, and Ted's. He was a powerful person in the family who also tended to keep a pretty low profile. Other than his wife, Jean, and his brother-in-law, Ted, he really didn't have close personal friendships with the Kennedys. Put it this way, there aren't a lot of warm family anecdotes about Stephen Smith, but somehow he managed to stay out of the line of fire by just keeping his nose to the grindstone and doing his job. He wasn't politically ambitious, though he toyed with the idea of running for mayor of New York City in 1969. He generally believed that politics was a game better played by the Kennedy brothers, certainly not their in-laws. When he took issue with another person's ambition, such as he did with his brother-in-law Sarge's, people knew it and paid attention to it. In Stephen Smith's mind, Sargent Shriver was on a par with Peter Lawford. That's how Pierre Salinger once put it. He had little respect for either of them, but at least Peter never tried to run for office. Siding with Stephen Smith against Sargent Shriver was just about everyone who had ever supported Bobby, including aides Arthur Schlesinger Jr., Ted Sorensen, and Kenny O'Donnell. Some of us didn't believe Shriver to be intellectually equipped enough to handle the demands of the presidency. That's how Schlesinger once put it. It was difficult to fathom such criticism, considering Shriver's mammoth achievements, but politics does have a way of sometimes making the most reasonable of men act like competitive children in a schoolyard. Another issue had to do with what might happen in 1972. For instance, if the winner of the 1968 race was the Democratic nominee and Shriver was his VP, what would happen should the president decide not to run again in 72? If Ted was interested in running at that time, how would Shriver's presence in office affect things? Or what if the winner was the Democratic nominee and Ted decided he wanted to challenge him by vying for the party's nomination in 72? How would Shriver's presence affect that scenario? As usual, Sargent Shriver found himself in the way of Kennedy ambition. Still, Shriver decided to take some secret meetings in Paris to determine the feasibility of his being added to Humphrey's Democratic ticket. We need Ted's approval, he finally decided. That's the only way this thing can work. But that was easier said than done, though. After Ted sent word that he definitely wasn't interested in running himself, he agreed to meet with Sarge in Paris to discuss the matter. That much-anticipated meeting was set for the second week of August 1968 at Shriver's home. One person who worked for Eunice Shriver as a personal assistant when the Shrivers were in France recalled Sargent Shriver's being locked away in his private study, waiting for Ted's arrival that second week in August 1968. He took no calls and spent hours studying certain issues so that he would be able to present his case to Senator Kennedy, recalled the assistant. Shriver's study was enormous and graceful looking, with a carved pine fireplace, pine-paneled walls, fine antiques all about, and expensive, comfortable furniture with rich colors on chintz fabrics. There was also a great deal of French oil artwork of great value, just as there was all over the ambassador's residence. Of course, there were books everywhere. He was an avid reader. Also in this study, and only in this study, Sarge put mementos of his public life. This room was Sargent's private sanctuary, in the sense that there were no mementos of his public life anywhere else in the sprawling mansion. At his homes in the States, both at Timberlawn and at the Kennedy compound, Sarge had his own bedroom that was decorated in much the same way as his study in Paris, and it had the same purpose, as a safe haven from which he could escape the madness of his wife's world. His sons used to love going into his bedroom because, as Bobby Shriver put it, you had a sense that things were different in there, that it was a world apart from the Kennedys. It was the Shrivers' world. Indeed, Sarge had all of his best suits hanging in the closet, his finest coats and hats and other apparel, all orderly and in pristine condition. His bottles of expensive cologne were lined on his bureau, along with his gleaming cufflinks and shining watches, and there was never any dust on anything. Books about politics, science, and religion were perfectly arranged on shelves. Moreover, all of his stellar achievements were memorialized only in his office in Paris or his bedrooms in Virginia or Massachusetts, nowhere else in the homes. In these special rooms would be found many framed pictures of Sarge with an assortment of political figures, such as President Lyndon Johnson, President Dwight Eisenhower, and other dignitaries, including, of course, Jack, Bobby, and Ted, everyone looking courageous, strong, and determined. We'd been told that Mr. Kennedy left the States and was on his way, but that his plane had been delayed, recalled Eunice's former assistant. After the passing of several hours, Mrs. Shriver came into the house, ran up the stairs, and directly up to the study. She seemed agitated as she raced by me and burst into the study. "He hasn't even left America, Sarge," Eunice exclaimed, according to the assistant's memory. Shriver was at first confused. "What are you talking about?" he asked his wife. "Ted," Eunice exclaimed. "I just spoke to Joan. Ted is still in the States. He's not coming, Sarge." "What?" Sargent responded. "But that's not possible. His office told me he left the States hours ago." "Well, it's apparently not true," Eunice said. "It's not true." As members of the staff congregated in the hallway to see what was going on, Sargent told Eunice that maybe there'd been a scheduling conflict and that they should give Teddy the benefit of some doubt. However, Eunice said she was certain there was no mistake. She decided she would call her mother to find out what had happened. Eunice then made a transatlantic call to Rose Kennedy. Apparently, either Rose hung up on her daughter or Eunice decided to terminate the call herself, judging by the way she slammed the phone down after a very brief conversation. "This is your time, Sarge," Eunice then said, turning to her husband. "You've worked hard for it, and you deserve it." Noticing the household employees who were now standing in the hall, Eunice turned to face them. "What are you all doing out there?" she demanded. "There's no show here. Nothing is happening in here that concerns any of you. So go about your duties and leave us be." With that, she slammed the door shut. The Shrivers stayed in the study for another hour. When they emerged, Eunice seemed somewhat calmer. There, Sargent said to her, his arm around her. "She repeatedly had me place calls to Mr. Kennedy, but he was never available to her," recalled Eunice's former assistant. Later that day, Eunice was seen outside on a patio in the garden, walking back and forth slowly with her beads in her hand, saying the rosary. The problem, of course, was what it always was, Ted Kennedy's selfish nature. He really didn't care about Sargent Shriver's ambition. He was concerned with his own. He couldn't help it. That's just who he was. And those who knew him well understood that a major part of his, indeed, of any successful politician's psychology was his ego, his absolute belief that he had the right answers, the solution to important problems. "It comes with the territory," was how Sargent Shriver put it. On August 19th, 1968, though, Ted finally buckled under family pressure to telephone Sargent Shriver in Paris. According to what Sargent would later recall of his conversation with Ted, he started off by reminding Ted that never once had he ever asked him or anyone else in the Kennedy family for any favors. All he had ever asked for was a chance to implement the important projects in which he was interested, all for the good of the country and to the credit of JFK and LBJ's administrations. Therefore, he could not understand why Stephen Smith or anyone else in the family was so intent on attacking him. Ted conceded that many Kennedy supporters and family members were still angry at Shriver because they felt he could have done more to help with Bobby's campaign. Teddy reminded Sarge that his acceptance of LBJ's offer to be ambassador to France at precisely the same time Bobby was getting ready to run for office did not ingratiate him to anyone in the family. Be that as it may, Sargent responded, all he was now asking for was Ted's neutrality, even though he would of course preferred Ted's total support of a Humphrey Shriver ticket. Instead, Sarge was asking him for much less. He simply didn't want Ted to speak out against him. Could Ted offer him at least that much? Maddeningly for Sarge, Ted had to admit that he really wasn't sure. He would have had to think about it. He did allow, though, that he would at least talk to Stephen Smith and ask him to stop bad-mouthing Sarge to others. That was pretty much the gist of the conversation Sargent had with Ted on that August night, at least according to Shriver's notes. It was disappointing at best and certainly not much for Sargent to feel good about in terms of Ted's or the Kennedy family's support of his political ambitions. 3 days later, on August 21st, Ted gave his first speech since Bobby's death. Quote, "There is no safety in hiding," he said. "Like my brothers before me, I pick up a fallen standard. Sustained by the memory of our priceless years together, I shall try to carry forward that special commitment to justice, to excellence, and to courage that distinguished their lives." He said that he intended to return to the Senate, but would not run for office. In other words, he had no intention of being Humphrey's vice presidential running mate. Quote, "Each of us must take a direct and personal part in solving the great problems of this country," he said. "Each of us must do his individual part to end the suffering, feed the hungry, heal the sick, to strengthen and renew the national spirit." A week later, on August 29th, 1968, Hubert Humphrey made it official. He was going with Maine Senator Edmund Muskie as his running mate. In the end, Humphrey and Muskie would lose the race, of course, to Richard Nixon and Spiro Agnew. Ted had been afraid that Nixon might get elected if Bobby ran and lost, and that's exactly what happened, even after Bobby's death. To this day, many political pundits believe that Humphrey might have won the presidency had he had Sargent Shriver at his side and the Kennedy family's blessing of their union. If so, who knows how that might have affected history? One can't help but wonder what the world might be like today had there never been a Watergate. Of course, Sargent and Eunice Shriver were both greatly disappointed by what all had happened in 1968. Typically, though, Sargent decided to focus on his work and resist the temptation to become bitter. In politics, Sargent Shriver, ever the diplomat, concluded, "When men are playing for such stakes, you can't count on personal ties and shouldn't take things personally," unquote. He hoped he would have had another chance at political office, though even he had to admit that it seemed that the odds were starting to stack against him. As far as Ted Kennedy was concerned, all of this political melodrama involving his brother-in-law and his sister was just a blip on his radar screen. It didn't seem to matter to him at all, and soon he would have even more reason to be distracted. And that, my friends, is the close of this chapter on Sargent Shriver. In the next episode, episode 4, we are going to talk about Ted Kennedy and Chappaquiddick. So that is a chapter you definitely won't want to miss. This author, J. Randy Taraborelli, has some details and facts about Chappaquiddick that I bet you never knew. I certainly didn't, and I thought I knew quite a bit about Chappaquiddick. So I hope you enjoyed this chapter on Sargent Shriver. I really did. I think it's probably actually my favorite chapter in the whole book. Shriver, in a way, is kind of my favorite Kennedy, even though he wasn't a Kennedy. And it is a fascinating thing to think about, isn't it? How history might have been different, how differently the country might have turned out had Hubert Humphrey and Sargent Shriver won the presidency in 1968. So I'll give you that to think about until we meet again. I will see you on the next episode of The Kennedys After Camelot. I'm Laurie Spencer. Thanks for listening.